Frank Turek couldn't believe it when this atheist walked up to him and said this.
Well, I would say that most of the evidence points to that being completely false, because the people at this time and Mark, the position that he was in socioeconomically, had no knowledge of Greek at all.
Oh, no, sure they did.
I disagree. I think most historians would disagree with that, and I think most biblical scholars admit that Mark did not write the Gospels according to Mark. You just attest to it.
I mean, I get it. Convincing an atheist about the historical authenticity of the Gospels is never going to be easy, but Frank's epic response to the young man's skepticism changes the narrative. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button for more videos like this.
Would you agree the Bible is written by men?
Oh, sure.
I study linguistics, and I do a lot of stuff with languages, and to my knowledge, and I think to a lot of biblical scholars, but I can't name me off the top of the head because it's something I just recently was reading, but ancient, it was like some form of like ancient Greek was the original version of language that the New Testament was written in. Do you believe up there it says opponents admitted Gospels written by disciples? Are you saying written, like the Gospels according to Mark were written by Mark, or are you saying that just disciples is in somebody that follows like the teachings of the Bible or something like that?
Who wrote the Gospels is the question, or?
Yeah, just addressing the one point, saying the opponents admitted Gospels written by disciples. So I was just wanting a clarification.
Okay, yes, well, as far as we know, the writers of the New Testament, there's 8 or 9 writers dependent upon who wrote Hebrews. Most of them bear the name of the person, like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, except, you know, the letters of the Apostle Paul, there's about 13 of them, and then there's other letters written.
So Mark, in the Bible, wrote Gospels according to Mark. Yes?
He wrote the Gospel according to Mark.
Okay.
That's what the earliest evidence shows, yes.
Well,
now, he was probably getting his information mostly from Peter. That's the thought there.
Well, I would say that most of the evidence points to that being completely false, because the people at this time and Mark, the position that he was in socioeconomically, had no knowledge of Greek at all.
Rather than just be upfront and call the Gospels a fairy tale, this young man tries a different approach. So, by his thinking, if Koine Greek, which was the original written language of the New Testament, had a socio-economic barrier that ostracized the poor and the uneducated, then Mark couldn't have written the book of Mark, and therefore, the entire thing is a fabrication. Then he's historically right, at least in the Koine Greek part. Following the conquest of Alexander the Great, Koine Greek became the common speak in most of Eastern Mediterranean, but it still encountered some resistance among Israelites at the time. So the average Israelite in the street still spoke Aramaic. However, as spotless as his logic may seem, there's still some holes, and Frank doesn't hesitate to point them out.
No. I'm saying that most people spoke Aramaic at that time. Most people also did not speak Hebrew, ancient Hebrew that was mostly attested to religious figures, and as fishermen and as these followers of Jesus, they were not in the church, they were not wealthy, they did not have high socioeconomic standing that is associated with knowing either ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek.
Well, what you're doing, though, is you're taking aggregate data, Matthew, and you're applying it to individuals, and you can't do that. You can go the other way. What you can't do is, like suppose you say that the average, just I'm making something up, the average income in Fairfax, Virginia is $100,000 a year per household. And that's the average. You can say, okay, that's the average, but you can't point at one person in here and say, you're making $100,000. You can't take aggregate data and apply it to individuals, just like you can't take the aggregate of the knowledge of the first century and apply it to Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, because you don't know if they were a special case.
Responding to questions like these from an atheist, it's always tricky. And that's why I say hats off to Frank Turek for being able to match the skepticism with logic. Because if this were a Christian asking this question, all I'd have done is pull up Acts 2, 7 through 11, where the Bible talks about the disciples speaking in languages that they couldn't possibly have known except by the Holy Spirit. Or when the educated chief priests, the Pharisees, or the Sadducees marveled at the boldness and unfettered eloquence of Peter and John in Acts 4:13. The truth is that the Holy Spirit had broken socioeconomic barriers, granting them knowledge of languages they ordinarily wouldn't have known for the propagation of the gospel. But that's just one part of it, and I imagine it wouldn't interest an atheist, so that brings us back to Frank's point. Aggregation works, but only in a general sense. You and I know it would be simply illogical to think that what's obtainable on the average is obtainable for all. I mean, that's just not possible. There are bound to be exceptions.
Because you don't know if they were a special case
Yeah, but that's exactly my point, is that we don't know specifically. And so when you don't know specifics, you go by aggregate data because that's what the closest average person is.
But if you have testimony from reliable people that says they did write it, just like if I had testimony from reliable people that said that man did make $100,000, then I would say or 200 or whatever it was, then I would go with that rather than trying to apply the aggregate data to the individual.
Sure, but where do we see any evidence or statements that are reliable saying that Mark is able to speak and write exquisite point A here?
Kinda seems like what our skeptic needs is a bit more knowledge. Doesn't it look that way to you? Let's say we didn't have the testimonies and the attestations of the early church fathers like Frank points out. Let's say that we toe the same path with our young atheist and we go with aggregate data. Well, that same history that tells him that there were socioeconomic boundaries to the adoption of Koine Greek by the average Israelite also tells us that Koine Greek was the language of administration, commerce, and culture. I mean, it was a part of the process known as Hellenization, which is very much like what the British or the French did with their colonies. Now, let's just take a look at the occupation of the disciples. Paul was an educated Pharisee and a Roman citizen, so he definitely would have known Greek. Luke was a doctor, also educated. The others were also in line with commerce, either as fishermen or tax collectors. Now, if you know anything about commerce, you'd know that having inadequate knowledge about the prevalent language in the industry, well, that's one way to shoot yourself in the foot. And how can we forget the most important detail? The apostles and the disciples were extensive travelers who traversed the jurisdiction of Rome and beyond. Now ask yourself, would they have gone that far only knowing how to speak Aramaic?
The early church fathers widely attested the gospel writers to the names that we have now, and there is no other data from that time period which suggests any other authors.
Sorry, but the religious figures at that time are very notorious for completely fabricating information or records about religion.
Matthew, you are again taking aggregate data and applying it to individuals. What?
And I'm saying that because we have no knowledge of these specific people at that time, we have to go by the best possible information.
No, we do have knowledge. We have people writing and attesting about it.
Yeah, you're saying religious figures who, again, are notorious for going back into the period of time that Jesus existed, where the records were contemporaneous.
Matthew, let me ask you a question.
Sure.
What would the writers of the New Testament, what motivation would these people have to invent all this?
I don't claim to know any motivation.
Okay, so then why are you applying nefarious motives to these people that you don't even know?
Are you talking about... No, I'm talking about two separate people. You're saying that we have writings from religious figures who, in that same vein, fabricated evidence such as...
For some reason, our atheist doesn't see that what he's basically saying is that all ancient religious records that corroborate the authenticity of the Gospel's writers are fabrications. And there's no way that this fits into a logical argument without you clearly saying, I just don't believe. Because that's illogical in itself. There's no evidence that supports his position. Let's say that we have a few instances where religious leaders fabricated stuff. Is that evidence that every other religious corroboration is fabrication? I mean, that's rich, coming from people whose belief in authenticity of secular history literally comes from corroborations. If this is the line we're towing, then everything that has root in history is doubtful. But we don't see people saying all this stuff about secular things, do we? What reason would someone have to lie about the authors of the Gospels? What would it change if someone else had written the very same Gospels that we read today? Honestly, it beats me. But if you do know, I'd be happy to see your thoughts in the comments section. If you found this video interesting, you'd be doing someone a favor by sharing it with them. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.